Bartolomé de las Casas, from slave owner to advocate for mercy. The revolutionary impact of Jesus' teachings extended beyond the first century into the heart of Spanish colonialism, where a single sermon would transform a slave owner into history's unexpected champion of indigenous rights. In the tumultuous period of early Spanish conquest in the Americas, when European powers justified exploitation through theological arguments, one man's encounter with the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount would catalyze a profound reversal in thought that continues to influence human rights discourse today. Bartolomé de las Casas arrived in the Americas as a Spanish colonist fully integrated into the exploitative systems of his time. As a landholder under the encomienda system, he directly participated in the subjugation of indigenous peoples, viewing their labor and resources as rightful spoils of conquest. This perspective reflected the colonial mindset that merged economic opportunity with theological justification, a worldview that appeared entirely normal to Las Casas until a pivotal moment altered his perception. The catalyst for this transformation came from a Dominican sermon quoting Jesus' teachings on mercy from the Sermon on the Mount. This encounter with Scripture initiated a profound moral awakening as Las Casas recognized the stark contradiction between colonial practices and Christ's commands regarding mercy. The internal conflict tormented him. How could he claim to follow Jesus while systematically denying mercy to those under his control? His spiritual crisis forced him to reconsider whether the indigenous peoples he exploited were, in truth, his brothers and sisters in humanity. In a dramatic shift from exploitation to empathy, Las Casas redefined what it meant to embrace mercy. He relinquished his encomienda holdings, sacrificing considerable wealth and status, and began to see indigenous peoples as fellow bearers of divine image rather than commodities. His transformation transcended mere sentiment, becoming a comprehensive theological reframing of how Christian principles should govern human relationships across cultural boundaries. Las Casas devoted the remainder of his life to systematic advocacy for those he had once exploited. His seminal work, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, documented atrocities committed against indigenous populations while explicitly drawing from Jesus' teachings on mercy as its theological framework. The text served dual purposes: historical documentation and theological argument. Las Casas wrote with unflinching clarity, "What authority did you have to make such detestable war against these people who were quietly and peacefully living in their own land?" His pointed questions revealed how colonial practices fundamentally violated Christ's teachings. Where contemporaries employed Scripture to justify conquest, Las Casas reinterpreted Christian theology to condemn exploitation. His application of the Sermon on the Mount to colonial contexts suggested that Jesus' command to show mercy extended across cultural and racial boundaries. This theological reframing challenged prevailing interpretations that had conveniently excluded indigenous peoples from Christian ethical concern. Las Casas faced formidable opposition from those invested in colonial systems. Colonial authorities and fellow clergymen had constructed elaborate justifications for exploitation, often portraying indigenous peoples as inherently inferior. Against these entrenched interests, Las Casas advocated persistently for recognition of indigenous humanity and dignity. His advocacy extended beyond written criticism to direct political engagement. He traveled repeatedly between the Americas and Spain, bringing his case to the Spanish court and arguing for legal protections for indigenous communities. These efforts culminated in the historic Valladolid debate of 1550 to 1551, where Las Casas confronted Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda regarding the humanity and rights of indigenous peoples. The Valladolid debate represents a pivotal moment in human rights development. Las Casas' position that indigenous peoples possessed rational souls and inherent dignity directly challenged prevailing justifications for conquest. By insisting that all humans, regardless of cultural background, deserved protection from cruelty, Las Casas established theological groundwork for concepts that would later evolve into human rights frameworks. What makes this historical development particularly significant is how Jesus' teaching on mercy provided the foundation for broader recognition of human dignity. Las Casas' arguments emerged from within the colonial system itself, demonstrating how religious principles could function as internal critique of imperial practices. His transformation, from participant in exploitation to advocate for the exploited, illustrates how Jesus' teachings could fundamentally reorient an individual's relationship to power systems, challenging the assumptions that justified structural injustice. The implications of Las Casas' conversion extend into contemporary human rights discourse. His application of Jesus' teachings established precedent for universal principles of human dignity. The revolutionary potential of Jesus' teachings became evident in Las Casas' ability to recognize humanity in those his culture had systematically dehumanized. The monastic scholars, preserving knowledge through dark ages. As Roman power waned across Europe in the 5th century, a profound intellectual crisis emerged alongside political fragmentation. Libraries fell into disrepair, schools closed their doors, and the sophisticated educational system that had characterized the classical world began to disappear. In this gathering darkness, an unexpected force would become civilization's intellectual lifeline, not armies or emperors, but quiet communities of monks guided by a theological principle drawn from Christ's teaching to love God with all your mind. The collapse of Roman infrastructure threatened centuries of accumulated knowledge. Literacy rates plummeted dramatically, with classical texts, repositories of philosophy, science, literature, and history, facing extinction as institutions crumbled. Within monastery walls, dedicated spaces called scriptoria became sanctuaries of learning. Picture Brother Matthias, hunched over a manuscript of Cicero's orations, his fingers stained with ink, eyes straining in the dim light of a single window. The scratch of his quill on parchment breaks the profound silence as he carefully forms each letter, understanding his work as a devotional act, a fulfillment of Christ's command to love God intellectually. These monk copyists worked with extraordinary patience, each manuscript demanding months of meticulous transcription. Like lamplighters in a vast darkness, they preserved the flickering flames of knowledge that might otherwise have been extinguished forever. Their labor constituted both practical necessity and spiritual discipline, transforming intellectual pursuit into divine worship. This theological principle rendered scholarship itself an expression of devotion to God. The monastic preservation effort proved essential for works by Aristotle and Cicero. The manuscripts produced in these scriptoria often represent the only surviving transmission of texts fundamental to Western intellectual tradition. Had these documents perished during the political upheaval of the early medieval period, the Renaissance's recovery of classical learning would have been impossible. These monks served as civilization's archivists, carefully tending the seeds of knowledge through Europe's intellectual winter. The Venerable Bede exemplified the monastic scholar who preserved existing knowledge while advancing original scholarship. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People provided a comprehensive account of early English history, demonstrating how monastic intellectual traditions produced new knowledge while preserving ancient wisdom. Bede's work integrated rigorous historical methodology with theological reflection, embodying the synthesis of faith and learning characteristic of monastic scholarship. Alcuin of York made profound contributions during the Carolingian Renaissance, serving as intellectual architect for Charlemagne's educational reforms. His efforts to establish schools and develop curriculum based on classical texts established foundations for Europe's educational future. Alcuin's educational program would eventually evolve into cathedral schools that preceded universities, demonstrating how monastic intellectual commitments shaped broader society. Women also played significant roles in this intellectual enterprise. Hildegard of Bingen's contributions to music, medicine, and theology reveal the inclusive nature of monastic intellectual life. Her writings engage deeply with intellectual traditions while offering original insights across multiple disciplines. Hildegard's example challenges simplistic narratives about medieval intellectual life, demonstrating that theological commitment to loving God with all your mind transcended gender boundaries. The monastic intellectual tradition ultimately birthed Europe's earliest universities. The founding documents of institutions like the University of Paris and Oxford reveal direct connections to monastic educational practices. These universities maintained the monastic emphasis on theology and liberal arts while gradually expanding to encompass new fields of inquiry. The structure of university education, with its emphasis on textual analysis, disputation, and comprehensive understanding, reveals its monastic heritage. Medieval theologians interpreted Jesus' command to love God with one's mind as explicit justification for intellectual pursuits across disciplines. Knowledge was understood not as merely practical, but as inherently valuable, a means of honoring the divine through intellectual exploration. This theological understanding created space for comprehensive education that valued knowledge across disciplines. The monastic commitment to education gradually transformed European literacy, creating new pathways for learning beyond elite circles. Like tributaries flowing from a great river, monastic educational traditions eventually evolved into university systems that would circle the globe, bearing the imprint of their theological origins even as they adapted to new cultural contexts. This intellectual preservation carried implications far beyond Europe's borders. Had Jesus' teaching about loving God with all your mind not inspired these communities, many classical works might have vanished completely, fundamentally altering the development of Western thought. The monk's quill, guided by devotion, preserved civilization's memory when all other institutions failed.